welcome back. Today, we're diving into what I like to call a corporate autopsy. We're going to look at a mythic power struggle, pulling directly from chapter 76 of the 72 Demons of Solomon text, to examine the sheer chaos of Bael's high court. We're actually using this dark fantasy as a direct and honestly pretty powerful cautionary tale for modern executives. This explainer is all about what happens when a massive organization completely succumbs to unchecked C-suite egos and that desperate, destructive need to prove who is the most important person in the room.
So here is our roadmap for the explainer. We're going to break this whole breakdown into 6 crucial lessons. 1. The trap of superiority. 2. Bael's rigid doctrine. 3. Factions and competing truths. 4. The trial of the first. 5. Necessity over perfection. And finally, 6. Ego and institutional collapse.
All right, let's jump right into section 1, the trap of superiority.
You know systemic disease has taken hold when senior leaders literally stop doing their actual jobs. It happens in stages. Step 1. Responsibility becomes an identity. Suddenly, you're in step 2, where comparison completely replaces function. Kings stop calling each other brother and start throwing around terms like lesser crown. Every title just sharpens itself against another. And by step 3, well, this just boils over into open conflict. They aren't even arguing about the work anymore. They are obsessing over who is the most complete or the most ancient. It is the ultimate toxic office politics.
Moving on to section 2, Bael's rigid first doctrine. So Bael listens to all this bickering, and honestly, he feels insulted. He decides the host doesn't need another brainstorming session or council meeting. It needs a rigid doctrine. His quote here is absolutely chilling. Firstness is not sequence, it is sovereignty. Think about that. Bael is demanding that all other high-ranked executives reinterpret themselves merely as secondary expressions of his original crown. He's essentially telling his C-suite, hey, without me, you don't even exist.
This perfectly illustrates how an abstract doctrine turns into a weapon. Bael enforces his rule by literally withdrawing visibility from the chambers of the high court. It's wild. Wherever his rule is denied, the speaker's own shadow is forced to bow to them. The lamps dim. He weaponizes this rigid doctrine to force compliance. But you know what? In doing so, he deliberately creates massive internal instability, basically terrifying his team into submission.
This brings us to section 3, factions and competing truths.
To really make sense of this, let's translate this demonic hierarchy into a relatable corporate org chart. So you have the kings acting as the C-suite and the strategy wing. Then the dukes are operations and labor. They're the ones who actually move the armies and build the treasures. And the princes, they act as middle management, serving as witnesses and thresholds to power. Understanding these specific silos is absolutely key to understanding why the whole system eventually shatters.
So how exactly do these factions react? Well, Paimon, who represents agile strategy, pushes back hard against Bael's static legacy. Focusing entirely on wisdom, Paimon argues that a first step into a pit is still a fall, right? And a first word spoken without understanding is just noise dressed as authority. It's a huge burn. Paimon exposes Bael as an origin without a guiding philosophy. Meanwhile, Belial takes a completely different, way more insidious route, pure manipulation. Belial sees superiority not as some objective truth to prove, but as office currency. He starts handing out private recognitions, flattering Beleth on terror, Vine on adaptability, Balaam on prophecy. Belial literally weaponizes praise, validating the individual pride of every rogue executive and actively fostering deep division right behind Bael's back. And down in the lower ranks, the divide is just as stark. The dukes in operations are growing super contemptuous. I mean, they do all the physical labor. To them, a king is just decorative if they don't actually execute. A duke is kingship made operational. But on the flip side, the princes in middle management are completely paralyzed by fear. Bael tries to make them confirmers of his doctrine, but they realize that confirming toxic arrogance just traps them as accomplices.
Now for the climax. Section 4. The Trial of the First. To break this miserable stalemate, the court agrees to what is essentially a massive corporate audit. The spirit Andromalius steps up and sets one foundational rule for the trial. No crown may judge itself. Man, that single sentence instantly wounds the egos of a room full of leaders who had spent the entire time doing exactly that. It forces a true, objective test of interpretation.
So during this trial, the C-suite presents these hypothetical worlds to stress test Belial's doctrine. Paimon shows a world where a blind beginning completely collapses. Belial shows a world where a perfect obedience to a first king completely ignores approaching ruin. Asmodee proves that pure firstness becomes totally obsolete without transformation. And Boone? He reminds everyone that the dead remember a lot of first kings, and they are all equally buried in the ground. Together, they prove that while Bael might be the first, his beginning alone is entirely insufficient to actually run the world.
Which leads us to Section 5. Necessity over perfection.
Okay, pay attention to this because it is the ultimate leadership trap. Bael realizes that superiority by perfection is a losing game. Why? Because it can be objectively disproved, just like the trial showed. So he makes this terrifying pivot to superiority by necessity. He claims that even their arguments against him require a first question or a first desire. This creates a deeply toxic dependency where you can't escape his authority because he claims every counter-argument is actually born from his origin.
Bael reveals the absolute cruelest part of pride, its ability to absorb criticism and somehow call that absorption proof of greatness. He uses their own internal rivalry to validate his authority. He basically says, every objection you have is just another tribute to my original existence. He realizes he doesn't need to be sufficient or good or perfect. He just needs to be necessary.
Finally, we reach Section 6. Ego and Institutional Collapse.
Here we can clearly trace the chronological escalation of the entire collapse. It starts when partial truth becomes pride. Each leader really did have a valid point about their own value, right? But that pride hardened into doctrine. Then, that doctrine became the very architecture of the organization. And finally, that architecture became a prison. The High Court paralyzed itself because absolutely no one would budge. Bael built a court not of loyalty, but of those who preferred necessity to affection, a containment that very quickly became pure captivity.
The core tragedy here wasn't that Paimon, Belial, or Bael were entirely wrong. The real tragedy is that each was partly right. Paimon was wiser, Belial was freer, Bael was an origin. But their open disdain completely shattered the culture. They proved that when large groups share delusions of superiority, it is absolutely fatal to institutional norms. The first name became a wound that spread every single time one crown demanded another admit inferiority.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. While the C-suite bickered over titles, measuring their superiority, and mocking each other with all this beautiful vocabulary, the lower demons were listening. The dukes, the princes, the rank-and-file workers saw the complete and utter lack of unity. Listen, when your senior leaders fight over who gets to wear the crown, they aren't proving their superiority to the lower ranks, they are inspiring the lower ranks to question why titles should remain sacred at all.
So what are your lower ranks preparing to do while your leaders fight? Think about that for your own organization. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.